Lee Kuan Yew never believed that decline announces itself with drama. In his view, collapse is noisy, but decay is silent. Collapse provokes action. Decay breeds excuses. And if there was one pattern he warned against repeatedly, it was the tendency of comfortable, well-intentioned societies to mistake calm for competence and goodwill for competitiveness. When applied to New Zealand, his warning would not be that the country is failing, but that it is slowly losing ground without fully realizing it. New Zealand remains one of the most admired countries in the world. Its democracy is stable, its institutions are trusted, its society is cohesive, its international image is positive. People want to live there. These are real strengths. Lee Kuan Yew would never deny that, but he would ask a harder question. Admired compared to whom, and measured against what future? He believed that nations should never measure themselves against their own past, but against the fastest-moving competitors in their region and beyond. Comfort, he argued, distorts benchmarks. When life is good, urgency fades. When urgency fades, performance plateaus. And when performance plateaus in a world that is accelerating, relative decline becomes inevitable. Lee's worldview was shaped by harsh realities. Singapore had no natural resources, no strategic depth, no margin for error. Survival depended on speed, discipline, and ruthless clarity about priorities. That mindset produced a governing philosophy built around long-term competitiveness, not short-term satisfaction. In contrast, societies blessed with geography, distance, and stability often underestimate how unforgiving global competition really is. New Zealand's geographic isolation has long been an advantage. It reduced exposure to conflict, allowed independent policy choices, and fostered a sense of security. But Lee would argue that isolation is a double-edged sword. Distance from danger also means distance from pressure, and pressure, in his view, is what forces excellence. Without pressure, political systems tend to drift toward what is popular rather than what is necessary. Voters reward leaders who preserve comfort, not those who disrupt it. Politicians respond rationally. Over time, the system optimizes for harmony rather than performance. Lee saw this pattern repeatedly in advanced democracies, good intentions producing mediocre outcomes. He often emphasized that governance is not about being liked, but about being effective. Popularity, he warned, is a short-term metric. Relevance is the long-term one. A country can be admired for its values and still be sidelined in strategic, economic, and technological arenas. When that happens, admiration becomes consolation. In New Zealand, the signs of slipping behind are not dramatic. They appear in data trends rather than headlines. Productivity growth lags behind comparable economies. Infrastructure struggles to keep pace with demand. Housing constraints limit labor mobility. High-skilled workers leave for larger markets where capital, opportunity, and scale are greater. None of these trends alone signal crisis. Together, they form a pattern of underperformance. Lee would frame this not as policy failure, but as systemic inertia. Systems built around consensus are slow to change. Every reform is negotiated, softened, and delayed. Delay compounds. By the time reform is implemented, conditions have already shifted. The country is always responding to yesterday's problem. One of Lee's core beliefs was that small countries must overperform to remain relevant. Size is not destiny, but it imposes constraints. To overcome those constraints, governance must be sharper, faster, and more disciplined than in larger states. Singapore's bureaucracy was engineered for execution. Targets were clear, accountability was strict, failure was not romanticized. New Zealand's political culture, by contrast, places a high value on fairness, inclusivity, and social balance. These are virtues, but Lee would argue that virtues without prioritization become liabilities. When every interest is protected equally, no strategic direction dominates. Policy becomes reactive. Strategy dissolves into management. He was particularly critical of what he called soft underperformance. Systems that function well enough to avoid crisis, but not well enough to lead. Soft underperformance is dangerous because it does not provoke reform. Life remains pleasant. Institutions remain intact, but relative position erodes year by year. Another area where Lee's warning would be sharp is talent. He believed talent was the most decisive resource in the modern world. Countries that attract, retain, and empower high-performing individuals thrive. Countries that fail to do so stagnate. Singapore actively competed for global talent, often at social and political cost. Lee accepted those costs because he saw talent as existential. New Zealand, while highly attractive in lifestyle terms, struggles to retain its own top talent. Many young professionals see greater opportunity abroad. Higher wages, larger markets, denser innovation ecosystems pull them away. This is not betrayal, it is rational choice. but over time, it creates a hollowing effect. Lee would argue that lifestyle is not a substitute for opportunity. Quality of life without economic depth turns a country into a staging ground rather than a destination. People are educated locally, then leave to apply their skills elsewhere. The country invests, others harvest. He would also warn against over-reliance on natural advantages. Agriculture, tourism, and natural beauty provide stable income, but they do not drive exponential growth. Lee believed that nations must constantly ask what they are indispensable for in the global system, not what they are good at, but what the world cannot do without them. Singapore answered that question aggressively. It positioned itself as a logistics hub, a financial center, a governance model, a connector between regions. New Zealand has not articulated an equally sharp global function. Without that function, influence remains limited. Lee was skeptical of international praise. He saw praise as cheap and fleeting. Real power, he argued, comes from being necessary. Necessary countries are consulted. Optional countries are admired but ignored. That distinction matters in crises, negotiations, and long-term influence. The quiet slipping behind is also institutional. Policy cycles are short. Electoral incentives favor visible benefits over structural reform. Long-term investments compete poorly with immediate relief. Lee believed that leaders must sometimes protect society from its own short-term preferences. That belief made him controversial, but effective. He would likely observe that New Zealand's politics avoid confrontation at the cost of clarity. Difficult conversations about productivity, taxation, regulation, and competitiveness are postponed. Each postponement feels reasonable. Cumulatively, they create stagnation. Importantly, Lee would not argue that New Zealand should abandon its values. He would argue that values must be operationalized. Fairness without efficiency erodes prosperity. Inclusion without growth spreads scarcity. Stability without adaptation breeds irrelevance. He often said that the most dangerous phrase in governance is good enough. Good enough today is not good enough tomorrow when others improve. The global system rewards those who anticipate change, not those who react to it. From Lee's perspective, the greatest risk facing New Zealand is not external threat, but internal complacency. The belief that being decent, democratic, and peaceful is sufficient. In a competitive world, decency is a baseline, not a strategy. He would also emphasize time. Decline is rarely reversible once it becomes visible. By the time citizens feel economic stagnation, lost opportunity, and reduced influence, structural problems are deeply embedded. Early action is essential. Early action is also politically hardest. Lee's leadership philosophy rested on seeing uncomfortable truths before they became obvious. He believed leaders exist to absorb unpopularity today to prevent irrelevance tomorrow. That is a burden many modern democracies struggle to accept. New Zealand's future is not bleak, but Lee would warn that futures are not preserved by intention alone. They require relentless adjustment, relentless execution, and a willingness to disturb comfort in service of competitiveness. Quiet decline is seductive because it does not hurt immediately. It feels like stability. It feels like balance. But over time, options narrow, choices disappear, influence fades. Lee Kuan Yew's warning, applied here, would not be angry or alarmist. It would be surgical, calm, analytical, and deeply unsettling, because it would suggest that the moment of greatest danger is not when a country struggles, but when it believes it is doing just fine.